Hey there, pre-med. In this video, we're going to discuss the female reproductive cycle, which includes the menstrual cycle and the ovarian cycle. We're going to talk through the hormones, the body changes that happen, and that branching point between either repeating the cycle or going into our pregnancy cycle. We'll touch on some oogenesis here, where we're talking about the development of the egg, but really we're going to be focusing on the hormonal control and regulation of this cycle in females. Now, there is a lot going on in the female reproductive cycle, and in general, these are going to be average days and average times. So in real life, this is going to look very different. But for something like the MCAT, the important thing to recognize is that we have basically the mechanism cycle, which is our hormones and our ovaries, and then we have what's happening in the uterus or the menstrual cycle. So we have the ovarian side, which is in the ovaries, which are our reproductive organs, and involves a lot of the hormonal controls. In the ovarian cycle, we have three phases. The follicular phase, which goes from about day 1 to day 13-ish. Then we have the ovulation phase, which happens on average at day 14, although in real life females, this can happen anywhere from day 7 to day 20. But for the purposes of the MCAT, we'll say it's right in the center at day 14. Then after ovulation, we have the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. And that word's going to make a lot of sense once we talk through what's happening after the ovum travels to the fallopian tubes after ovulation. In our uterine or menstrual cycle, we also have three phases. We have our menstrual phase, which is usually from days 1 to day 4 or all the way up to day 7. This is when menstruation is happening and the uterine lining is shedding. Then we have what's known as the proliferative phase, where we're regrowing that uterine lining. This happens between days 5 and 14. Finally, we have the secretory phase, which happens after ovulation, usually around day 15, and goes to day 28. So we can see here that the secretory phase kind of overlaps with ovulation and the luteal phase. The menstrual phase overlaps with the follicular phase, and the follicular phase also includes some proliferative phase. So there's kind of connections between the three phases on both the ovarian side and the uterine side. Okay, so we have the two cycle definitions. We have our ovarian cycle and our menstrual or uterine cycle definitions. But what is happening? What is the cycle? Well, the cycle is the development of our oocyte and the release of the oocyte into the follicular tubes to be available for fertilization by the sperm. So in order to understand what's happening, we do have to have a brief discussion of oogenesis. This is not going to be the focus of the video, nor is it heavily tested on the MCAT, but I do want you to kind of understand from a gametogenesis perspective what's going on. So in humans, an interesting component of the female reproductive cycle is that when we're actually born with all of the primary oocytes that we're going to have in our lifespan. This happens at about 18 to 22 weeks in the prenatal phase, and our ovaries develop the primary oocytes. So this is our 2N, these are our diploid cells, and they are arrested or frozen in prophase 1 of meiosis. So when we're born, we have a bunch of these primary oocytes that are frozen. They're not progressing through meiosis at this stage. They're still diploid, but they're ready to go. And we're not going to produce any more of these cells after birth. So we kind of have what we have upon birth. This is very different than the male reproductive cycle, which continues to go through spermatogenesis and produce new sperm cells throughout their lifespan. So we have this frozen set of primary oocytes. And then when we hit menarche, or the onset of puberty with our first menstrual cycle, we start something called folliculogenesis, which just means that we're developing follicles. What are follicles? This is where it gets a little confusing in terms of the nomenclature, but follicles are basically our oocytes surrounded by a fluid and some other cells like granulosa cells. So I'm going to show you kind of the process of developing follicles. I don't want you to stress about memorizing this, but I do want you to recognize in general what's happening to our oocytes in this phase. So this is after menarche, as we hit puberty. So you can see here, this is the path of developing follicles. And again, don't worry about memorizing. I just want to show you kind of what's going on. So our primordial follicle, all right, which is here, this guy is where we start at birth. So this is our primary oocyte right in the center here, surrounded by fluid, and then these little purple cells are called granulosa cells. Then once we hit puberty, we start to develop these follicles. And so we're going to see that our granulosa cells change shape and start to replicate, and we start to get a little bit bigger, and we produce these primary and then secondary follicles. This is something that happens before we get into our hormonal regulation phase. So a whole bunch of these cells at once are developing into our secondary and then all the way into our antral follicles. So we have these big chunks of developing follicles, and it's kind of like a selection period where you have this big group of follicles, and then we have this fun little selection moment where only a few are chosen to fully develop. And once they're chosen, they're called Graafian follicles. They're now going to be subject to our FSH and LH response. So when our hormones start coming into our ovaries, these are the follicles that are going to respond to that and be stimulated. We can see here that we have our granulosa cells, our big follicle with our space is now bursting here after ovulation, allowing our oocyte to go into our peritoneal cavity, our abdominal cavity, and then travel to our fallopian tubes to either be fertilized or to go through our menstrual cycle. So a couple things to notice: when we're in our primordial follicle, we're in our primary oocyte. All right, this is our 2N, it's our diploid cell, and it's held and arrested in prophase 1 of meiosis. Once the follicle reaches the Graafian stage, which is also known as tertiary follicle, then we go through our meiotic phase and become a secondary oocyte. This is now a haploid cell, so it's just N, and we develop a polar body. So that division happens where we have a polar body that doesn't really have much in it, and then we have our secondary oocyte. This secondary oocyte is what's going to go off and develop into a zygote if it encounters a sperm, or again, be shedded out with the uterine lining if it is not fertilized. So now we have kind of the players here. So from here on out, when we talk about an ovum, I do want you to think about it as the secondary oocyte, the developed cell, the haploid cell. Prior to this, there's a lot of follicles that never fully develop and produce a haploid germline cell. So a lot of these follicles end up atrophying and going through apoptosis. They don't get selected for to make it to the final stage and become a secondary oocyte. That's pretty much all I want you to know. If you like to learn this stuff for fun or to prepare yourself for medical school when you will need to know these stages, please feel free to do so. But just know on the MCAT, it's really more about knowing that we have diploid cells as our primordial follicles, and then we do end up as haploid cells right before ovulation. All right, and those are the ones that have been selected for, and we only have a couple follicles that make it to that stage. Now let's get into the hormonal control and regulation, which is really where a lot of these MCAT questions come up. Okay, so you may have seen something like this in your book, where it's kind of showing you everything at once. It's showing you the days of the cycle on the top with the follicular, ovulation here at number 14, and then luteal phase. It's showing you the basal body temperature. An interesting feature is that the female body actually increases in temperature by about 0.3 degrees Celsius after ovulation. Then we have our hormone levels here, and this can feel very stressful and complicated as you see all these graphs. What do you need to know about it? Then we've got our ovarian cycle, the development of the follicle and release of the follicle as an ovum, right? It's complicated. And then at the bottom here, we have our uterine cycle, which is showing you the uterine lining, the shedding, proliferation, and then secretory phase. So there's a lot here. Personally, for me, I like to just go step by step and describe what's going on. So I'm going to switch my page and actually write it out for you, but please feel free to reference this diagram. We'll come back to it as we talk through each step. And I'm going to do that by having our HPG, our hypothalamic anterior pituitary gonadal axis handy, since we'll be talking about our hormone release. Okay, we're going to start with day one. We're going to assume that this is a regular cycle, and day one is the start of menstruation. This is where the uterine lining is shedding. All right, so we're breaking down the uterine lining. We have not fertilized our ovum, and so we don't have a zygote, and we're going to go ahead and go through menstruation. So what's happening here? Why is menstruation triggered? This is because we actually see a drop in estrogen and progesterone. I'm going to write it out here, but then in the future, I'm just going to use E and P, okay? Estrogen and progesterone are both necessary to maintain the uterine lining. When these levels drop, we shed that lining. So that's what's happening again here. If we go back to our little phase here, we're all the way at day one. What we can see is that our estrogen, which is our gray line, is pretty low, right? Our estrogen and our progesterone are pretty low here at day one. we see that they've dropped off pretty heavily towards the end of the cycle. So that is what's triggering the menses, the shedding of the uterine lining. Okay, so what impact is that lower estrogen and progesterone having on our HPG axis? Well, let's take a quick reminder. The hypothalamus is up in the brain here. That produces GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then goes down to the anterior pituitary and stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone and FSH. That then goes to our gonads, in this case our ovaries, which stimulate the release of estrogen and progesterone, our steroid hormones. If you need a review on this cycle and any hormone cycles, please feel free to check out my videos on the endocrine system. So we now have lower estrogen and progesterone, right? We're decreasing that. So what's been happening here, and this is generally what's happening, is the high levels of estrogen and progesterone have a negative feedback effect. When we decrease our inhibitors, right, our negative feedback, what are we going to do? Our end result is going to be to actually increase our levels of GnRH. So what's happening here is that low estrogen, low progesterone is releasing the inhibition, the negative feedback from our hypothalamus, allowing us to increase our levels of GnRH, which then of course will increase our levels of LH and FSH. GnRH and LH and FSH will always be going in the same direction. It's the estrogen progesterone stuff that's going to be doing our feedback loop. Okay, so now we're going to get into the connections that the MCAT wants you to make, which is not just, okay, we know the pathways and the negative feedback, but let's talk some cell biology here and maybe even some genetics, because as you know, the MCAT loves mixing and matching multiple categories. So I want you to think about something. Estrogen is a steroid hormone. What does that mean? That means that it can freely go through membranes. And most steroid hormones, their mechanism of action is to bind to a cytosolic receptor. So they get into the cell through passive diffusion. They bind to their cytosolic receptor, and then they go into the nucleus. And they have their mechanism of action by regulating gene expression at the DNA level. And so our estrogen receptor and our estrogen are our on and off switch for the production of GnRH and LH and FSH to a lower level in the anterior pituitary. So this is one of the things I want you to think about as we're going through this, is I want you to visualize what's happening here. When I said lower levels of estrogen are increasing our GnRH, what that really means, and you don't have to memorize the mechanism, but I want you to think about it. Okay, we have less estrogen binding to its receptor, so less estrogen and receptor molecules are getting into the nucleus, which means they're not inhibiting gene expression as much. They're not binding to the promoter and inhibiting our gene expression of our GnRH, so we're able to produce more GnRH. So that's what we're talking about when we say something simple like there's a negative feedback mechanism, right? I want you to make that connection because, of course, our steroid hormone mechanism of action, our cell diffusion, our transcription translation stuff, these are all testable topics on the MCAT. Okay, let's get back to our pathway. So now we have our estrogen and our GnRH and our LH and FSH. So we can see that these guys are starting to increase. And again, if we go back to our little path here, so we can see our FSH and LH, we can kind of start it from the back here, right? They're starting to go up, right? And then they kind of flatten out, they go up a little bit, they stabilize at a certain higher level. So we'll talk about that shortly. And again, FSH and LH can be seen as a proxy for GnRH levels as well. So as we're going through this follicular phase, what we're doing is our increased luteinizing hormone and FSH are stimulating our follicles to develop. So we have our follicular development happening, and that's happening all the way through days 1 to 14. And as the follicle develops, it releases estrogen. And again, I'm just going to write it as big E. So now our estrogen levels are going back up because our follicle, as it's being stimulated by our FSH, is now releasing estrogen. And again, it's going to be doing negative feedback. As those levels are higher, now it's going to bind to its receptor, get into the gene promoter region, and stop GnRH from getting transcribed and translated. So what we're seeing here is we'll see a leveling off, right? We'll decrease the GnRH, and I call it stabilizing LH and FSH levels. And this is because we don't want to be developing too many follicles past our tertiary point, right? We want to only develop a couple at a time and really only ovulate one egg at a time. So we want to make sure that we're not developing like 10 follicles, which is what would happen if we kept increasing FSH. But then, and we'll actually kind of pull this here, right before day 14 or right before ovulation, something wild happens. As estrogen increases in concentration in the body, it reaches this magical estrogen threshold. And as far as I can tell, we're still trying to figure out exactly why this happens. But what happens here is once a certain amount of estrogen has been released, once we have a high enough level of estrogen, it turns into a positive feedback. So all of a sudden, that estrogen receptor that's binding the promoter region and inhibiting is now acting as an activator. And there's some theories that say that it's binding to a different portion of the DNA, that it's interacting differently with the transcription factors. That's all beyond the scope of the MCAT. What you need to know is that something changes. And all of a sudden, we get this positive feedback on our GnRH and LH and FSH production. So what is that going to do? For this very short period of time, it's going to massively increase GnRH and cause an LH and an FSH spike. But the important one here is going to be our LH spike. All right, it's going to do it for FSH to some extent as well, but LH spike is really what we care about because that LH spike causes ovulation. So we can see that here on our graph. All of a sudden, right, everything's going low, but we see how our estrogen, our gray line, is going up and up and up, and then all of a sudden it reaches some sort of magical threshold, and boom, these guys that had been kind of decreasing suddenly spike. And the LH spikes way more. The mechanism of action really impacts the LH release, and that LH release allows for the follicle to burst. It's like boom, pressure, burst. And then all of a sudden we have our ovum release. So we'll go back to our follicular development here for just a moment and see that this phase, ovulation, is happening because of this LH spike. So then what happens? Well, now we're ovulated, we're off. Goodbye, ovum, go off and conquer. And our corpus luteum is formed. The corpus luteum, I like the name, it's kind of like luteus corpse, right? So due to the LH luteinizing hormone, we develop this luteum corpse. And this is all of the granulosa cells from our Graafian follicle, and they're still there and they kind of reform and they replicate. And what these guys do that's really interesting is they start to release progesterone. So let me go back to our writing phase. Now, ovulation has happened, and then we form the corpus luteum from our previous follicle. The ovum's gone, the corpus luteum is what's left over. This guy is producing progesterone. So our progesterone levels are going up. So again, let's go back to our little figure here. Again, progesterone has a negative feedback only. Only estrogen does the funky thing. So if progesterone goes up, now we're doing negative feedback. That means that our GnRH, FSH, and LH levels will level off. And this prevents multiple ovulations. This prevents more follicles from developing. So this is key that the corpus luteum has to keep producing progesterone so that we don't accidentally ovulate twice in one cycle, right? We don't want to be doing that. So now we have these GnRH, LH, and FSH levels. Let's go back to our graph of our hormones so we can see what's happening there. All right, so this is again post-ovulation. See how that progesterone just goes whoop? That's all because of the corpus luteum. Meanwhile, because we don't have a follicle anymore, our estrogen levels are kind of falling off. Some of the estrogen is being produced still by the corpus luteum, those granulosa cells, so we still kind of have a leveling off here. But in general, it's the progesterone that's preventing multiple ovulation from our corpus luteum. And as we go through, the corpus luteum kind of runs out, right? It slows down that progesterone production. And if there hasn't been a fertilization event, it's going to go down enough, and our estrogen and our progesterone levels will tank down enough to start that GnRH, LH, and FSH going back up. Again, if we stop the negative feedback by having low levels of estrogen and progesterone, we're going to allow that GnRH, LH, and FSH to come back online. So that's what's happening. Then we restart our cycle. All right, we're going to summarize this and add in what happens if there is a fertilization event. But before we do, I'm Amanda Brem, and I've been coaching pre-medical students on their MCAT journey since 2019. Please remember to subscribe to this channel for more videos on MCAT content, test-taking strategies, and mental fitness tips to help you perform your best on testing. And if you'd like live online lessons with me, plus a whole bunch of resources and test-taking strategies, please feel free to check out our next available live online MCAT cohort in the link in the caption below. Okay, ready to summarize? We have 3 phases broken up by a 28-day cycle. From days 1 to about 14, we have our follicular phase in our ovaries, or our menstrual and proliferative phase in our uterus. What's happening there is we started off with really low estrogen and progesterone levels. They bottomed out after the corpus luteum stopped producing those hormones. That released the negative feedback from our hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, allowing GnRH, LH, and FSH levels to start to rise. As that happens, the follicle that's being stimulated by FSH releases estrogen from its granulosa cells. That estrogen has a negative feedback loop. It prevents more GnRH and LH and FSH from being produced so that we don't produce too many developed follicles. But at some magical time right before ovulation, usually day 13 or 14, something crazy happens and our estrogen threshold is released, which means we have enough estrogen to transform it into a positive feedback modulator. So that estrogen now increases the transcription translation of GnRH, LH, and FSH, and that results in a spike of those hormones, particularly LH. LH, that luteinizing hormone spike, is what allows that tertiary follicle to burst and release that ovum out into our abdominal cavity and into the follicular tube. Then we have our luteal phase, right? In our secretory phase in our uterus, this is where our leftover cells from our follicle produce lots and lots of progesterone. And that progesterone has that negative feedback, keeping the GnRH, LH, and FSH levels low so that we don't ovulate multiple times in a cycle. Eventually, though, those progesterone and estrogen levels bottom out, restarting the cycle. But what happens if we fertilize the ovum? What happens if we form a zygote? If fertilization and implantation occurs, this is where sperm and egg meet, they form a diploid zygote, which then forms a blastocyst, which then embeds itself into the uterine lining. And what does that bunch of cells do? It produces HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. HCG is an analog of progesterone. Analogs are like synonyms, right? They basically act the same and have the same mechanism of action on receptors as that original hormone. So a progesterone analog is going to act just like progesterone. So it's going to bind to those receptors up in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary and keep our GnRH, LH, and FSH levels low. Again, maintaining the pregnancy so that we don't shed that uterine lining. Remember, it's those increasing levels of GnRH, LH, and FSH and low levels of estrogen and progesterone that drive us to shed the uterine lining. The HCG prevents that and helps maintain the pregnancy. Once the second trimester hits, now the placenta is producing enough estrogen and progesterone on its own to maintain the pregnancy, and so our HCG levels drop off. Now, there's a lot more to this, of course, but on the MCAT, the broad strokes and the connections to other biochemistry and biological concepts are really what's heavily tested. So as you're moving through these processes and pathways and cycles, I want you to think to yourself, wait, do I know where that estrogen receptor is? Do I know what's happening to increase our levels of GnRH? Yeah. Gene expression, right? We know about that from genetics. So please feel free to make those connections. Check out my other videos, again, on the endocrine system and my genetics videos to help connect those dots. And as always, happy studying.